Good evening, everyone. I'm here to talk to you about why applied research that investigates actual decisions by policymakers is so important in helping us move forward with the urgent challenge of climate change. Let me tell you about one policy that's been discussed for years, especially in countries that are using a carbon price already. I'm talking about carbon tariffs. Carbon tariffs ensure that not only domestic polluters pay for their emissions, but also polluters in other countries that haven't yet acted on climate change. Many leaders have strongly recommended carbon tariffs for years. Economists and other academics, Nobel Prize winners, climate activists, CEOs, politicians, even presidents. People have been raving about carbon tariffs for the past 2 decades. And there have been some efforts in parts of the world to apply carbon tariffs, in California and Europe. But none of these have actually been successful. Even though experts have been telling us for a long time to use carbon tariffs, nobody in the world has done so. And until recently, we didn't have any explanation why that is. Academics have largely focused on issues that aren't actually that relevant in practice. Researchers studying carbon tariffs simply haven't been looking at what's going on in the real world. That's why it's so important that researchers use empirical evidence from real-life policymaking to help us move forward with finding effective solutions. I'll tell you a little bit about my doctoral research in which I've investigated this puzzle of carbon tariffs using empirical data. In theory, carbon tariffs have potentially significant benefits in terms of the economy, the environment, and politics. But around the world, policymakers haven't really moved beyond just discussing these tools. That's when I thought to myself, we need to figure out what's the problem here. California has been considering carbon tariffs for more than a decade. Policymakers even started seriously developing a carbon tariff for imports of cement 5 years ago. But then, all of a sudden, they stopped. And instead, they've promised to continue, reflect, and revisit the idea later. The situation has been similar in Europe. For some reason, carbon tariffs just haven't come to fruition. So in my doctoral research, I investigated what it is that keeps government from using carbon tariffs. I talked to over 40 experts on carbon tariffs, and that includes policymakers, representatives from businesses and industry, the environmental community, and consultants. I also studied literature from political science, economics, and law. And I analyzed quantitative data from economic modeling and trade statistics. And what I found in my research is that there is overwhelming opposition to carbon tariffs from businesses, industry, and even NGOs. Most academics don't realize this. I have explained in my research why, in the real world, there's such resistance to carbon tariffs. First of all, although carbon tariffs are meant to protect industry from foreign competition, carbon tariffs can actually expose industry to higher costs. Because of this, companies prefer alternative ways to help them transition to a more sustainable future. In California, the oil and gas and cement industries received over $600 million in subsidies in 2015 alone. These subsidies are much more attractive to industry than carbon tariffs. Stakeholders also have other issues with carbon tariffs. They're afraid of retaliation from other countries, which could lead to trade war. Europe, for example, wanted to use a carbon tariff for the aviation industry. But there was fierce international opposition. China had ordered airplanes from European manufacturer Airbus. These orders were worth $12 billion. But China put these on hold in response to Europe's plans to use a carbon tariff. Russia threatened to prohibit European airlines from flying over Siberia, And also India threatened to ban European airlines from its airspace. Also the US threatened retaliation. All this eventually led Europe to backtrack on its carbon tariff. So governments and businesses in Europe were concerned about retaliation and possible trade war. I have shown in my research that these are the main issues preventing carbon tariffs from being used more widely in practice. Now that we have this knowledge, it's time to think about how we can address these concerns to make progress with effective climate policy. I've been able to shed light on this conundrum of carbon tariffs using empirical evidence. It wouldn't have been possible to do this without looking at what's going on in the real world. That's why practice-oriented research that accounts for actual decisions taken by policymakers on the ground is essential. We can learn so much from decision makers and stakeholders, talking to them. Empirical research helps us understand the challenges that practitioners face. What's also important in helping us move forward is interdisciplinary research. Looking at issues not only from one perspective, but drawing on several complementary disciplines like political science, economics, and law. So researchers need to be open to multiple disciplines and take into account empirical evidence from the real world to help us develop effective sustainability solutions.